The glass hit the floor before anyone breathed. Shards scattered across marble like frozen rain. "Why is the maid teaching my son?" Calvin Pierce roared, stepping into the library doorway. His voice cracked through the air like a whip. 7-year-old Ethan froze, the marker still in his hand. Across the whiteboard, neat rows of numbers glowed under morning light. Too advanced for a child his age. Beside him stood Imani, the black maid, her palms trembling but her chin high. "Sir," he asked how to find a pattern. She said quietly. Calvin's jaw tightened. "You're paid to clean, not to lecture my son." He strode forward and, with one sweep of his arm, sent the notebooks flying. Pencils clattered, paper fluttered, a glass of water toppled and shattered. Ethan jumped at the sound. Imani didn't move, only blinked once, steadying herself as a red flush climbed her cheek. From the corner, the private tutor Ms. Ashley Fairmont hissed, "This is what happens when hell forgets their place. A maid teaching a white child? Unbelievable." The words struck harder than the noise. Imani's lips parted, but before she could speak, a sharp crack echoed, a slap that silenced the room. Ashley's hand still hung in the air, trembling with self-righteous fury. Ethan gasped, his small voice breaking. "Stop. She didn't do anything wrong." Calvin froze. Even he hadn't expected it to go that far. The sound of his son's cry hit something old and buried inside him. Imani stood still, her cheek burning, eyes glossy but unbroken. "I wasn't overstepping," she said softly. He only wanted to understand. Her voice didn't shake, and that made the silence heavier. Ethan looked at his father, tears welling. "Dad, she makes math make sense." Calvin turned away. "Go to your room." "But Dad, now..." The boy ran, leaving behind a trail of small wet footprints on the tile. When the echo faded, only the hum of the air conditioner remained. Imani bent to gather the papers one by one, aligning them perfectly on the desk, even the torn ones. "Thank you for letting me help," she murmured, her voice low but clear. Then she walked out, slow, dignified, leaving silence to accuse the people she just left behind. Calvin exhaled, realizing his hand still shook. Somewhere upstairs, Ethan's muffled sob carried through the hall, and for the first time in a very long while, the billionaire didn't feel powerful. He felt small. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening, and the world needs to hear them. The night after the slap, Imani couldn't sleep. Rain tapped against the small window of her servant's room, soft and steady, like a memory knocking to be let in. She sat on the edge of her bed, tracing the faint red mark still lingering on her cheek. It didn't hurt anymore, but the echo of humiliation did. When she closed her eyes, the mansion faded. In its place appeared a small classroom, old paint, crooked posters, and 20 black and brown children who once called her Miss Imani. Their laughter filled the room as she wrote fractions on a dusty whiteboard. "Math," she used to say, "isn't about numbers. It's about fairness, balance." One of her brightest students, Darnell, had been accused of cheating. He was 12, smart, outspoken, and unafraid to ask why when the rules made no sense. That day, the principal, a white man in a stiff gray suit, stood towering over the boy. "You people always find excuses," he'd snapped. Imani had stepped between them. "He didn't cheat. I saw his work. He understands the problem better than I do." The silence that followed was thick, dangerous. And in that silence, her career ended. 2 weeks later, she was escorted out of Lincoln Middle School for insubordination. No severance, no hearing, just a locked door and whispers that followed her out to the parking lot. She remembered standing in the rain that day, clutching a box of worn-out textbooks, her reflection blurring in the puddles. It wasn't just a job she lost. It was the only place she ever felt she truly belonged. Now, years later, the same pattern replayed. Different room, different faces, same injustice. Only this time, she couldn't afford to lose control. She pressed her palms together, whispering to herself, "You keep your dignity, girl. They can't fire what's already broken." Downstairs, the house hummed with silence. Somewhere, the billionaire slept soundly in sheets worth more than her yearly pay. But in her small corner of the mansion, Imani found strength not from wealth, but from memory. She would not run this time. She would keep teaching. Quietly, carefully, because the boy upstairs still needed someone who believed in him. She looked out the window once more. The storm had passed, but the night still felt heavy. Some lessons, she thought, never stop hurting. But the best teachers keep teaching anyway. The house felt heavier the next morning. The kind of silence that doesn't rest. It lingers, it listens. Calvin Pierce sat in his office, a half-finished cup of black coffee cooling beside him, the guilt from last night still gnawing through his chest. He opened his tablet, scrolling through the home surveillance feed. For a moment, he hesitated, then tapped library. 5:12 p.m. The screen flickered. There she was, Imani, calm and patient, showing his son how to spot patterns. Her tone wasn't lecturing, it was nurturing. She didn't talk down to the boy. She lifted him up, and Ethan was smiling, wide, alive, proud. "See," she said on screen, her voice soft. "You already had it in you." Calvin watched the sun beam as she clapped lightly for him. He hadn't seen that joy in months, not since his wife passed, not since the house went quiet. He swallowed hard. Then came the moment he'd entered, his own angry voice echoing through the speakers, the crash of glass, the slap. He flinched hearing it again. It was worse than he remembered. The sound of his own cruelty filled the room. He paused the footage and stared at the frozen frame. His son's terrified face, the maid's tearful strength, the tutor's twisted pride. He didn't see a mistake. He saw himself. For years, Calvin had believed discipline was love, order, control, rules. But in that moment, he realized what his son needed wasn't control. It was compassion. He leaned back in his chair, covering his face with both hands. The truth hit harder than any boardroom loss. The woman he'd humiliated had done something he hadn't managed in years. She'd reached his son. Outside, morning light crept through the blinds, striping his desk in gold and shadow. He looked at the tablet once more, the paused image of Imani's hand resting gently on Ethan's shoulder. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he whispered, "Maybe I was the one who needed the lesson." For the first time in a long while, Calvin didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like a father, one who had failed, and was finally starting to understand why. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. The whisper started quietly, the kind that slipped through polished walls and marble halls. By midweek, half the neighborhood already knew that Calvin Pierce's black Maid was tutoring his son. To them, it wasn't kindness. It was scandal. At Eastgate Academy, parents murmured in the pickup line, "She's the maid, isn't she?" One woman whispered, teaching a billionaire's child math like she's some kind of savior. Another scoffed, "Boundaries are gone these days. First, it's math. Next thing you know, she'll be in charge." Inside the mansion, Imani moved as she always did. Quiet, steady, professional. But the air felt different now. Eyes followed her longer. Voices stopped when she entered a room. Even Miss Fairmont, the tutor, had changed her tone. Once dismissive, now venomous. "I hope you're proud of yourself," she sneered one afternoon as Imani passed through the corridor. "You've made this house a headline." Imani didn't respond. She just smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides both pain and pride. "Children learn best," she said softly, "when adults stop pretending they're better teachers." That line burned. Fairmont's cheeks flushed red. She stormed off. Meanwhile, Calvin sat at a downtown board meeting, pretending to focus on quarterly reports. But his phone buzzed, message after message from acquaintances and colleagues. "You're letting the help raise your son? Not a great look for the Pierce brand. You're making people uncomfortable." He stared at the screen, anger creeping up the back of his neck. Uncomfortable. That word said everything about the people who said it, and nothing about what was right. That evening, he returned home early. Ethan was in the study, beaming, showing Imani a drawing he'd made of her teaching under a glowing sun. At the top, In a child's handwriting, it read, "Miss Imani makes numbers feel easy." Calvin stood silently at the doorway, something shifting inside him again. He realized what the gossipers feared most wasn't shame. It was change. Imani noticed him there, but didn't stop speaking. "Remember, Ethan," she said, smiling gently, "understanding isn't dangerous. Ignorance is." Calvin turned away, jaw clenched, a small smile ghosting across his face. He was beginning to understand, too. The next morning, the sun looked dull against the mansion's white stone walls. Inside, Imani polished the dining table, her reflection faint on the glass surface. She heard the front gate buzzer, then the butler's cautious voice, "It's just a mail." Minutes later, a thin white envelope lay on the counter, no name, no stamp. She opened it slowly. 6 words stared back in red ink. "Know your place before we remind you." Her breath caught. For a moment, she just stared at it, not afraid, just tired. Then she folded the note and slipped it into her apron pocket. If fear wanted space, it would have to wait. Upstairs, Calvin Pierce was pacing. He'd heard about the whispers turning uglier, words like unfit, dangerous, inappropriate being thrown around in private circles. But seeing the note in her trembling hands was different. He felt like a slap to his own face. "Who did this?" he asked, his tone low but sharp. Imani shook her head. "Someone who's afraid I might be right." Calvin's jaw tightened. "I'll double the security." "You don't have to," she replied softly. "They want me gone, not protected. But I won't run again." He looked at her for a long moment, realizing she meant every word. There was no fear in her, only quiet defiance, the kind of courage that made men question themselves. That night, when the house fell silent, Imani sat by the kitchen window, writing in a small notebook. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, a teacher's hand that never forgot its purpose. She wrote, "They can threaten me, but they can't unteach what's already been learned." Meanwhile, in his office, Calvin replayed the same thought over and over. For years, he'd built walls to keep people out, to keep order in. Now a woman who cleaned those walls for a living was tearing them down with truth. He closed his laptop, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark garden where motion lights flickered. He whispered to himself, "Enough pretending this is just about appearances." Because it wasn't anymore. It was about a boy who finally smiled again. It was about a woman who refused to bow. And it was about a man learning that silence is the loudest form of cowardice. Calvin Pierce wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, he knew which side of history he wanted to stand on. 2 days later, the story left the mansion and found the world. It began with a small education blog, an anonymous post titled "The Teacher Who Still Teaches." No names, no photos, just words describing a woman fired for defending a black child years ago, now quietly helping another one find his voice. By noon, it had spread. By sunset, hashtags flooded social media. Imani didn't know at first. She was in the kitchen, kneading dough beside Ethan, who was humming his favorite tune. When Calvin Pierce entered, phone in hand, his face said it all. "They know," he said. Her hands froze over the dough. "Know what?" "Everything." He showed her the article. Thousands of comments, messages, reposts. Some called her a hero, others threw the same old poison. But for the first time, the support was louder than the hate. Imani read the screen in silence. She wasn't used to being seen, not like this. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't want attention. I just wanted him to learn." Calvin nodded, and now he's teaching the world what that means. That night, she stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights. Somewhere out there, strangers were fighting for her name, her story, her dignity. The same world that once erased her was now rewriting her in bold. Meanwhile, Calvin sat at his desk drafting something new. A proposal for the Pierce Foundation for Teachers Reborn, a scholarship for dismissed educators who were victims of racial bias. At the top of the document, he wrote, "Inspired by Imani Brooks." He didn't tell her yet, not because he wanted credit, but because he knew the power of surprise, the kind that heals deeper than words. In her small room, Imani closed her notebook and whispered to herself, "They took my classroom once. Now they gave me the world." Outside, the rain began again, gentle, cleansing, patient. The kind that doesn't wash things away. It reveals what's always been waiting underneath. A week after the article went viral, the world inside the Pierce mansion changed again. Reporters waited at the gates. Camera flashes turned the driveway into daylight. But Imani Brooks didn't hide. She still served breakfast, still smiled at Ethan, still carried herself with the same quiet dignity that made the powerful nervous. One morning, the doorbell rang. The butler whispered, "It's someone from the school board." Imani wiped her hands and stepped back as Calvin Pierce entered the foyer. Waiting there was Pauline Everett, chairwoman of the same board that once erased Imani's teaching license. Her voice dripped with polite poison. "Miss Brooks," Pauline began, "the board wishes to extend an official apology and a reinstatement of your teaching certificate." Imani blinked. "After 7 years?" Pauline smiled thinly. "Closure is important, but we ask for discretion. No interviews, no statements. Let the noise fade quietly." Calvin crossed his arms. "She's not signing your silence." Pauline turned to him. "You'll lose support if this continues." He didn't hesitate. "Then I'll build my own support." Imani's voice was calm, but firm. "I appreciate your apology, ma'am. But what I lost wasn't just a license. It was trust, and that has to be earned, not traded." The woman left, flustered, her perfect composure cracking at the edges. As the door closed, Imani stood in the sunlight, streaming through the tall glass windows. She exhaled slowly, not from fear, but from freedom. Later that evening, Calvin called her into his study. On the desk lay a nameplate that read, "Imani Brooks, Director, Pierce Foundation for Educator Renewal." She covered her mouth, tears catching in her throat. "You believed in my son when I didn't," Calvin said quietly. "Now it's my turn to believe in you." Ethan ran in, holding a drawing. 3 figures hand in hand beneath a rainbow of numbers. At the top, in messy crayon, it said, "We all learn from each other." Imani knelt, hugging him tight, the nameplate still warm in her hand. She had walked into this house as a maid. She was leaving it as a teacher again. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it.